We hope you enjoyed the short break, and we warmly welcome you back to the second part of the first day of our event. Good to have you still with us. We thought after a break, you are ready for the hard facts of QI, the legal stuff. Goods and services are freely traded in the EU. In order to facilitate the exchange of products, EU-wide requirements exist. The new legislative framework, short NLF, forms the regulatory framework for this. This framework and the product legislation in Germany and the EU will be topic of our next presentation. I would like to extend a hearty welcome to Mr. Matthias Schmidt-Gerdts from the EU Commission, Head of Market Surveillance at DG Internal Market, Industry, Entrepreneurship and SMEs, or in short, GROW. He will introduce us to the NLF and the product legislation by highlighting the most important principles and its relationship to QI. Matthias, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Kirsten. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for having joined for this presentation. So today's my presentation today will be in three building blocks. First, I'll look at the context and the concept of the new legislative framework. Then I look at some key features, and finally, I'll talk about an evaluation that we are currently conducting. So let's start with the presentation. Maybe the next slide, please. So, thanks. As Kirsten said, the single market, or one of the key freedoms and key principles of the single market, is the free movement of goods in the EU, and it may be worth recalling that this free movement of goods is ensured either through the adoption of common EU rules for specific products. That's the first part, is the EU harmonization legislation, or where such common rules do not exist, by requiring mutual recognition of national requirements. So then one product travels to another country, it needs to be accepted by that receiving country. Next slide, please. The internal market for industrial products is divided in two parts. So the first part is the harmonized area that I just described. It consists of about 80%, roughly speaking, 80% of the non-food products in the EU. And the other 20% are the ones that are not harmonized and are therefore subject to the mutual recognition principle. And you can see here in the slide a few sectors or product groups for which this is applicable. I will not now read them out to you, but we have them in the pack. In the harmonized area, so if you zoom down a little bit, you can see that there are two different approaches for EU rules. We have the so-called old approach. This consisted in setting very specific and very detailed technical requirements for products. And this was imitating the way national legislation used to be in the past. And today it's quite exceptional. You see here the motor vehicle sector is an example for this, because the adoption process is quite lengthy. You need to negotiate all the different requirements. And it is also quite difficult then to keep it up to date with technical progress and technology. Most of our union harmonization legislation follows today the so-called new approach, which consists in setting only technological neutral essential requirements in the legislation while relying on harmonized standards for the technical specifications. And this regulatory approach is considered to ensure safety of products, but also allows for a level of or a degree of flexibility, and then the possibility to adapt and adjust to technical progress and technological developments. Next slide, please. So the NLF, here we look at the objectives of it. The new legislative framework was adopted in 2008. And it was adopted to ensure that union harmonization legislation would guarantee a high level of safety and protection of public interests of products, as well as of the free movement. So to have a common framework that would apply to all products in a coherent manner. To that aim, the NLF has the following specific objectives, and here you have them in the list. First, to reinforce the new approach to product legislation based on technologically neutral essential requirements. To ensure that EU product legislation would be simple, clear, and coherent, as products are in many cases covered by several pieces of EU legislation. So you have a piece of product and there you have different directives applying to that product at the same time. To ensure also more effective market surveillance and procedures to assess the conformity of products to the applicable legislation. And I believe my predecessor speaker, he spoke about these topics in some detail. We want to strengthen the quality of third-party conformity assessment bodies in the EU through the setting of an EU framework for their accreditation. And finally, there is also the wish to enhance the value and credibility of the CE marking. And you all know the CE marking. Let's move to the next slide, please. So here you see the base text, if you wish, for the new legislative framework. It consists of two texts that were both adopted in 2008. On the left, you have the regulation 765 of 2008. And that sets the EU legal framework for accreditation and conformity assessment bodies for market surveillance of products and CE marking. The market surveillance part has now been replaced by regulation 2019-1020, but here you really have the base text. And then on the right, you have the decision 768 of the same year, 2008. This decision has no direct legal value, but it contains a number of reference provisions, or you could also say templates for any future EU product legislation. So this is sort of the building side out of which to take then the elements for future legislation and to keep it coherent with the NLF, the new legislative framework. You can see here all the elements that are given in this decision. Let's move to the next slide, please. Here, don't worry if you can't read this slide. It's just to illustrate a little bit the products that are covered by the new legislative framework so far. So we have, since the adoption, it was always the political objective to align progressively union product legislation to the reference provision of the decision, so to the right-hand text that we just had on the previous slide. And today we have more than 20 pieces of legislation that follow this model decision or the templates that are enshrined in this decision. And you can see here the different sectors and areas, or to mention the toy safety or the radio equipment directive or the low voltage directive. You can just go through the list. And it's growing as we speak. Next slide, please. Let's zoom in and I come to the second part of the presentation, the second building block. Let's look at a few key features of the NLF. So the first one is, or are the essential requirements. So they offer a level of protection of public interests. And here I name the most important ones: health, safety, and protection of consumers or the environment. So these are some public goods that need to be protected, and the essential requirements that are contained should ensure this. And then the second key feature are the harmonized standards. So they detail the technical solutions to meet the essential requirements, but they are voluntary. So producers of goods can actually choose another method. They're not binding. And secondly, if you follow a harmonized standard, your conformity with the essential requirements is presumed. So you have this advantage then that you're deemed to satisfy this condition. Let's move to the next slide, please. Here, In the new legislative framework, we have tasks and responsibilities which are quite divided to also have the right, the protection of conflicts of interest and so forth. So first of all, there are duties on the manufacturer, the producer of goods. The manufacturer needs to ensure the compliance of their products with the applicable legislation. So of course, they need to follow the applicable conformity assessment procedure. They need to draw up or draft the technical documentation and also the declaration of conformity. They need to affix the CE marking to the product. So there's no authority who does that, but it's the manufacturer. You need to allow, you need to ensure the traceability of the product and then the necessary identification elements. And also you need to provide the instructions and safety information. Voila. You also can appoint as a manufacturer an authorized representative by a written mandate. So that's also part of the key features. Let's move to the next slide, please. The importers also have some obligations under the NLF. So first of all, they must, and shall is the word, but they, in non-legal speech, they must place products on the market that are compliant. So first of all, they need to ensure that the producers fulfill their obligations on everything that we just mentioned. Actually, it's the same list. So it's the conformity assessment, it's the documentation, the CE marking, the traceability. They need to indicate their name, the registered trade name and address. So that's important. They also need to keep a copy for 10 years of the declaration of conformity. And they need to ensure that technical documentation is made available to the authorities upon request. And here say national authorities, of course, that can also be regional or local, even local authorities. It just, if we talk national as a commission, we always mean the non-EU part of the administration. Next slide, please. So we spoke about the manufacturer, we spoke about the importer, and here we look at the distributor. A distributor, of course, has the duty of care. And they also need to verify all the formal requirements once again. And if there's an obligation on the manufacturer, this can apply to either distributor or to importer if they place themselves the product on the market under their own name or trademark, or if they modify a product so that the conformity may be affected. So there's a further processing of it, and then the original purpose is no longer there. Let's move to the next slide. We come to the fourth key feature, which are the conformity assessment procedures. And here we have different modules for this process. The choice of procedure follows a risk assessment. So you need to look at the risk that your product brings in relation to the intended use. Of course, you can use a lot of things for many other purposes, but it's the intended use that you need to look at. We have the supplies declaration. So that is that we actually prefer if you have the lower range of risks, low to medium. And you have a third-party assessment if you are considered to be in a higher risk range. Voila. Let's move to the next slide, please. We have the same rules for the designation and supervision of notified bodies. So notified bodies are conformity assessment bodies. So organizations that verify the conformity of a product with the applicable legislation. And notified bodies are those that are actually notified by an authority of a member state. And then they tell the Commission that these bodies can perform actually the conformity assessment tasks. And then accreditation for us is the preferred method to actually prove that a notified body has the right competences. Okay, so let's move to the next part, which is the post-market. So it's everything that we talked about now is sort of until the product is placed on the market. And now we look at the sixth key feature, which has now been absorbed by the market surveillance regulation, which is here the market surveillance. The key feature talks about the government's role. And it is actually to enshrine, to make sure that the law is held up by the different people in the chain, manufacturer, importer, distributor. This may range from the control of formal requirements, but it can also go into testing, so to sending samples to a lab for examination. What the new legislative framework tries to ensure is that the roles of the different actors are clearly separated, so to avoid conflicts of interest. We have, of course, the regulator setting the rules, standardizer, so the ESOs in a normal, or the DIN in Germany, that then set the standards that are applicable on a voluntary basis to ensure or to show that you have fulfilled the requirements. Accreditors, the conformity assessment bodies, or even notified bodies, and then the market surveillance authorities. So, and the range of market surveillance authorities in Europe is very broad. So we have hundreds and hundreds of them, and depending on the product, depending on the country as well. Some countries have a more federal structure, such as Germany. Other countries have a very unified structure. It depends also a little bit on the size of the country. And that has then an impact on the architecture or the landscape of the market surveillance. Voilà, that was in a nutshell the second part. So some key features I just wanted to highlight. And let's move then to the next slide, please. I come to the third part of my presentation, that is a process that has just started. It's the evaluation of this new legislative framework, and I thought it would be important to share with you some elements of that ongoing process, because it brings you a little bit into 2021. So the first question, of course, is to ask why an evaluation? Because I've now demonstrated, hopefully, the beauty of the NLF. Why on earth would we go and evaluate it? So we've actually decided that it was necessary to evaluate this new legislative framework because industry and society at large today are fundamentally different from the situation in 2008 or even in the times before, when the new legislative framework was prepared. Because the decisions, of course, date from 2008, but the process didn't start in 2008 that then led to the decision. Voilà. First of all, the products are increasingly digital, and we can see that every day. And they're continuously also modified after having been put on the market or into service. Products have now more frequently a second life because they are reused or refurbished. We see that with the very famous brand of mobile phones, but you have that more and more. There's also the circularity, the green objectives. So there are quite a range of products that go into a second life. And this is, of course, something that is important for sustainability reasons. So we have the circular economy, but also to ensure that product safety must be addressed in these instances. So a second life cannot mean lower safety. Conformity assessment procedures in the NLF need to ensure that products are compliant even if the environment changes. So we need to think ahead, and we need to incorporate all these elements. And maybe worth mentioning, and we are still not out of the pandemics, that the COVID-19 crisis has also put to the test the resilience of the union product legislation based on the NLF. And it has shown whether or not we can cope with an urgency situation when there's not when there's not ample time for going through all these steps in detail and with all the lengths that they normally take. Let's move to the next slide, please. So the focus of the evaluation is on 5 criteria. We look at 5. It's just to give you an idea of what this is about. First of all, whether the NLF remains relevant to address the digital and circular developments. So this is also part of this green and digital transformation of the industry. Then, are the conformity assessment procedures which should ensure that the product is in conformity with the applicable legislation, is that still up to date? We look at the rules for notified bodies, which are third-party, as I said, third-party conformity assessment bodies that are sometimes required by law to intervene in the conformity assessment. We look at the accreditation system that demonstrates the competence of conformity assessment bodies. We look at the CE marking and other information on the product, not just the CE marking, but also other mentionings. You can see that on many packages. And then whether the lack of a crisis instrument for urgency situations renders the NLF more or less efficient. So this is a bit going back to what I said before. Maybe to finish on the scope of the evaluation, and then I'm done, and I'm also happy to take questions. In view of these issues, the evaluation will address the specific objectives that the NLF wanted to pursue, or still wants to pursue. We look at a range of years, so 2014 to 2020. We cover the EU and the EEA EFTA states, so the 3, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Iceland. But we will not cover the market surveillance part because we had just adopted this regulation on market surveillance that only is fully applicable as from July this year. So that's too early to evaluate. And we are also looking at the standardization system in standardization strategy that is to come out probably still this year or very soon. So that will be the place to look at fixes, if needed, of the standardization system that we have at the moment. Voila. This is all I have for you today. I hope it was interesting. And as I said, Kirsten, I'm available for questions. Here in the slides, you also have references to basic text, but you probably get the slides anyway. And the last slide is just a thank you slide for your patience.
Thank you very much, Matthias, for this profound and important insight. We still have some minutes left for questions. So I would firstly pose one, and I hope we have time for a second one, but firstly one. From your perspective, how can we create more political buy-in to promote the implementation of the new regulation, as a competitiveness and recovery instrument?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think that globally, the NLF has shown that we can also apply it in the crisis. So we have shown that we have a resilient system in place, and we were able to deal, for example, with face masks when there was a dire shortage in Europe quite quickly and quite reasonably with the procedures. So I think that stood the test of time. But we need to see if we need some fixes going forward in the NLF to also cope with the green and the circular. So an example that I mentioned is the reuse or refurbishment of products, and also an enhanced it's a linkage between the product and the software in the product. So if you have important updates, does it make you have this whole debate, when does a product become a new product because of the digital elements that may be changed? Do you need to update also then all these requirements that you needed to fulfill when you first put it on the market? placed it on the market. So these are questions that we are currently looking at, and we want to come to a conclusion in the course of next year. That doesn't mean that we immediately initiate a legislative process to revolutionize everything, but it is a careful examination, which is very inclusive, with a broad consultation and also targeted consultation. So the important stakeholders and member state authorities will be asked for contributions to see what are your reflections on the NLF, because it is a toolbox. It is given to help ultimately to ensure good flow of the goods, so that we have a a baseline scenario when we have a reliable system that is actually, as I said, also applicable when you have one product that falls under different categories and there are different product legislations that apply. So a common and coherent set of rules really helps in this regard. Is it now, as it stands and comes from 2008, the final wisdom now in the 20s of this century? Let's see. I mean, we have an open mind, but we see really also the advantages that this system has provided. But every now and again, you just need to check whether the legislation is still fit for purpose.
Thank you. Can you give a very, very short answer just to this very short question? Should there be a higher EU budget for market surveillance?
Oh yes, I definitely believe so. I would really ask the finance ministers to grant us, and the parliament also to grant us even more money, because we can do a lot with the funds available, like joint actions, like testing facilities and financing very important actions to make our market surveillance in Europe and across the Union more robust.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Unfortunately, we have to close this round now because we have to go to the next item. Thank you again, and au revoir à Bruxelles.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.